Hi, my name is Kassidy Homolka. I am a junior and I am majoring in anthropology with a minor in women and gender studies. Today I'm going to be presenting over identity and film, third wave feminism's impact on the movie industry. So real quick, I just want you to take a moment to yourselves and think about what all four of these images have in common with one another from their four films. So now that you've had a moment to think to yourselves, hopefully you came up with the conclusion, and it's alright if you didn't, but all four of these films use stereotypes about women. Heartless, powerful women, boy-obsessed girls, obsessed with social acceptance, and powerful, sexy heroines. Being able to recognize stereotypes in films or overly used movie tropes, which are common ideas about a person or a group of people represented in media, is one of the first steps in which you can take in order to separate yourselves from just an audience member to a critical thinker of film and other forms of media. Understanding feminist ideas and theory work is one of the tools in which you can use to accomplish such. As Bell Hooks explains, there will be no mass-based feminist movement as long as feminist ideas are understood only by a well-educated few. Looking at how identity is perceived within the viewer's eye and the creator's mind is one way in which we can create this separation. Looking at queer theory and reflection theory are two of the tools in which we can use. Queer theory builds upon sexuality, gender, lesbian, and gay studies, and also builds upon the term queer, which essentially means the non-binary forms of not just looking at gender as man or woman or race as black or white, but looking at every single entity which can retain that form. Intersectionality is also a form in which was created around the start of the third wave of feminism, which is what we are now, and became a popular argument in which to emerge diversity among different groups of people. Intersectionality basically means looking at all the multiple identities, so race, gender, sex, class, and so forth, that make up a single person, and how that affects their viewpoints. Reflection theory, which is John Locke's construction of knowledge, or the initially perceived idea from sensory of the external world that becomes agreed upon by multiple individuals, separating the idea from opinion and belief. So basically, looking at this chart right here, there's first a form or an idea. In this case, it's beauty. Then that form becomes conceptualized by a group of people who agree upon what that term means, and it becomes its knowledge of that meaning. And then that form is put into different entities such as objects or people. Then those entities are imitated through works of media. However, it is not just enough to understand knowledge and where ideas come from. It is also important to understand cultural values and societal norms. Societal norms are basically what becomes normalized to the public and how knowledge is interpreted through representation in media. The best way to understand societal norms is by looking at the products, services, and ideas in which a society produces their normalizations. As designer Adam Young-Stroh puts it, those products reinterpret the dominant trends in order to put a positive spin on what that society values. Looking at culture, which is the complex and elaborate system of meanings and behaviors that define a way of life for a group of society, lets us know what those norms will be based upon what a culture values. However, culture values can change based upon the times and the groups of people that are able to voice their life stories and concerns to the masses. By looking at film censorship, we can also see how values within a society change over time. Looking specifically at the Sedition Act and Espionage Act that were reinforced right before women gained the right to vote in 1920, we can see how film reinterprets the governmental restrictions. In the MPPDA, which is the Motion Picture and Producer and Distributors of America, created the Hays Code to further implement the Sedition and Espionage Act, which were basically restrictions on what people could and couldn't say about the government. The Hays Code were self-censorship guidelines that occurred from 1934 to 1968. During this, you can see this time period was kind of the low point in which feminism was moving. Obviously, feminism was still going on, but the first wave kind of ended and the second wave hadn't started yet. And then in 1968, when the MPPDA creates a new self-rating system, that's when the second wave starts to emerge to the public. That self-rating system was a lot more open and had less guidelines on what films could and couldn't say, and they were based on the age rating system as we're familiar with like PG and PG-13. Today we have a lot less guidelines in what media can and cannot say. For example, in 1996, the Supreme Court ruled that online speech was protected under the First Amendment, and that was a big step in initializing what minority groups of people were able to project to the public views and how those views could be reinterpreted through film. However, stereotypes are still being used commonly in film, and representation is still low. It's a slow change, and I created a survey in order to understand why films were still using these overly used tropes. The survey was basically to understand how people's identities and experiences with feminism affect how they interact with film. So the questions mostly went over people's identity, their experience with feminist concepts, their movie watching experience, and their familiarity with overly used tropes. I do not have the analysis done. I have all the data collected as the survey ended on March 26th, but hopefully when I finish the data analysis in my thesis paper, then I'll be able to answer whether or not these two hypotheses are supported. People with minority identities will notice more overly used film tropes, and the second one, people with more experience with feminist concepts will notice more overly used film tropes. So why is it that films are still using stereotypes even though people are able to implement their sides of stories? More people that have often been oppressed in different groups of society are having more voice. Is it because people simply aren't noticing them in film, or do they simply not care? With this survey that I created, and after analyzing it, hopefully it'll be able to answer this question by looking at identity representation between majority and minority viewpoints. Then also looking at intersectionality and how emerging identities can shape the understanding of different topics and through their points of view. Right now, there are acts in which to create more representation within film, but they won't be implemented until much later. For example, the Academy Aperture of 2025, which is a Minority Oscar Inclusion Act, is to force industries to include people of minority identities in all film creation roles, such as directors, actors, prop managers, every single role that makes up creating film. Hopefully, with this act, it will provide non-binary perspectives for the creators and also for the audience, as we saw with queer theory. And hopefully it will also force the audience to question their ideas of knowledge and what they thought was, what ideas they thought were accurate into representation of minorities, as we saw with reflection theory. However, this isn't implementing till 2025, and even this alone is not enough to change the negative views of groups of people in film. It is not just the job of the creators, but also the job of the audience members and the viewers to implement change. The way in which you can do that, to make yourself a critical thinker, is to engage yourself with unfamiliar material and educate yourself as you're doing now, listening to my presentation, to pay attention to the representation of different peoples, not just in film, but all forms of media, to understand the norms, where norms and values come from, as we saw with film censorship and the changing of different feminist waves, and to not just listen to majority views, because that creates biases within opinions and viewpoints, but to listen to all people's perspectives, even if they don't share your values. As social activist and president of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom says, social advance depends as much upon the process through which it is secured as upon the result itself. In order for you to become a critical thinker, you must open your mind to multiple perspectives of all identities. I'd like to thank all survey participants, my fellow Anthro 500 students, Dr. Blake with her help with the survey material, Dr. Landau for her assistance with proofing and the IRB process, and thank you for all of you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.